If you're watching this, then the Endgame has already happened. And you know how things went down. And nothing will ever be the same again. Well, maybe. And you know, as a matter of fact, perhaps that's something we should talk about. Let's take a little bit of time, if you will. We'll talk about exactly what happened in the Endgame and kind of what I think of it. Maybe we should even talk about how time travel works. And finally, let's try to look forward to what the future or possible future of the MCU could be. Or maybe we could start calling it the MCM? Let's visit these three things in the latest GotBot Goes to the Movies. Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, Dennis Moulton, aka GotBot. As always, please like, comment, share, and of course subscribe. Check out Machinery of Man, The Everything Factor, Transformers Collectors, NL, and me everywhere. And this is different than what I usually do. This is even a different location than where I usually am because my family and I just recently saw the culmination of 22 films. The culmination of 10 years of storytelling with Avengers Endgame. Which, technically, I suppose you could say is a part 2, if Infinity War could be considered part 1. And I'm left feeling... I'm not even sure how I feel about what happened. But, for a long time, I've been wanting to discuss more films on the channel, and what a better time than now to kind of jump in to the MCU, or, like I mentioned, possibly the MCM. So let's talk about the film first. Now, though I put the warning up at the beginning, I'm going to say it again now. There will be spoilers throughout this. Sometimes major spoilers. But it's a discussion that I've been wanting to have, and I've been waiting a little while to put this review out, as well as this discussion, in the hopes that most people, most fans, have seen the film. But if you have not, then I urge you to please see it first, then come back and you and I will have a little chat about everything, and try and dissect it and our feelings about it. On the good side, simply put, this is more, I think, than just your run-of-the-mill movie. This is a cultural event, a cinematic event. Not to say it's a masterpiece, but this is an event, a cultural event. And even those who are less interested, I believe one day, somehow, some way, sooner or later, they will probably see it. I put this very akin to when Star Wars first came out, and the hype that was around that, and the cultural phenomenon that it became, making Darth Vader a legendary villain along the way. It's not every day that something that could be coined a cultural event comes along, but this would definitely be one. It's always bad form to offer spoilers to films, but in this case it almost seems like a line you don't cross. It seems morally wrong to offer spoilers for the Endgame. If anything, we have now all been introduced to Thanos, who may, for right or wrong, very well be one of, if not the greatest movie villain of all time. Arguably. Certainly, he is likely here on out to appear at least on everyone's top 10 list. Why? Because if nothing else, he won. In Infinity War, he won. When else have you seen a villain win? Whether it was a temporary win or not is almost irrelevant. So on the good side, The Infinity War is a spectacle. It has all of these tremendous heroes in it, and these fantastic actors. It has so much action, so much drama, and the cinematography and special effects is unparalleled with what they were seeking to accomplish. And perhaps no scene in any film ever has sent chills up my spine as much as when Captain America finally says the words, "Avengers, assemble." And you could see the two sides of the army coming together in the most epic of conflicts, not knowing exactly how things would turn out. In Infinity War, we had a rather straightforward story. Though everybody got their screen time, it's amazing where that story began and where it ended in terms of the number of environments visited. But it was basically a cat and mouse story with the bad guys, led by Thanos, of course, and the good guys, led by Cap, Iron Man maybe, all seeking to claim the Infinity Stones as their own. It was a classic plot, presented very, very stunningly well, with a couple of shocks and twists along the way, such as Gamora being sacrificed for the Soul Stone. And by the end of it, we revisited a line that Thanos himself had said earlier in the film, that he would rest and look upon a grateful universe, or thankful universe, whatever exactly the words were. And indeed, at the end of that film, he did, setting us up for the Endgame. And, as I said, visually, it was not disappointing. The fan service throughout the film was not disappointing. Absolutely not disappointing. All of the arcs and stories came together and culminated from Hulk's arc, where we were left with Banner saying, "Hey buddy, we're going to have to figure some things out," to this hybrid Hulk, so to speak, that I absolutely dig. I've been waiting for this Hulk to kind of evolve and come about, which I think is a tremendous story to be told, especially since really he never had his own film. Well, he had that one film. But I think the most popularized version of Hulk is really visited from Avengers onward, culminating, of course, in Endgame. Thor. I still feel like there's more to be told with that story, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Nevertheless, we saw a depth of character. We saw depth of character for Iron Man, for Captain America, and for so many others. We saw different sides of these characters, and I think that that is a testament to just how invested we had become in them. I know I certainly was. So, whether it's good, bad, or has plot holes, I think that visually, action-wise, and kind of because of our investment in the characters, this is definitely a film worth seeing and will go down as one of the greatest superhero films of all time. Now, what about the bad? Well, on the bad side, there is some convoluted aspects to the storytelling, specifically how time and time travel works, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It draws on a lot of theory and a lot of kind of, current thinking that goes into how temporal mechanics works. And while I am no scientist, and I am sure that the way I understand it is probably not exactly accurate, I will present my understanding of how it works and sort of what that could possibly mean for the future. Like I said, in a little bit. Nevertheless, it is sort of glossed over, and perhaps deliberately so, and it does leave us with certain questions that could be interpreted as plot holes, but I don't particularly think they are. Still, for the average moviegoer, this convoluted nature may leave them scratching their heads somewhat, and therefore, potentially, hurt the movie experience for them. I don't know if anything can exactly ruin it, because at the end of the day, we have the bad guy seeking to have all the power and enact his evil, nefarious plan. And we have the heroes pulling out all the stops to stop him. There's a weakness in that perhaps certain characters are left at loose ends. And there's a weakness in that perhaps the resolution for certain characters is not exactly what fans had hoped. Of course, as we all know, life does not necessarily always work out with the happiest of endings. But we can hope that it works out with a fitting ending, a justified ending, and that's exactly what this film gave. Now what about the ugly? There isn't really any ugly. Unless the kind of questions that we're left with really bother you. But I feel like Marvel and Disney are playing a long game. And while this may be the end of Phase 3, let us not forget that Phase 4 is around the corner. After all, if you actually look at some of the signage for this film, it says Avengers, Endgame, Phase Finale. Kind of like this. Exactly. Now, what about time travel? That's sort of where we are too. And before we can go on and talk about some of the weaknesses and potential plot holes and questions that we're left with, we really need to understand, or at least have some semblance of understanding, how time travel works here. So I'm going to try to cover that now. So pay attention, stay with me, see if you agree, and if you don't, by all means, let me know how you understand it, because I'd love to hear that perspective as well. This will also sort of lead us into where we may be potentially going. When you and I come back right here, we're going to talk just a little bit about some of the questions that are left at the end of this film, and what is to come or potentially coming up.
So, we need to talk about how the time travel aspect works in the Endgame. Avengers Endgame is a brilliant movie. It draws on a lot of modern thinking that goes into how time travel works. And I don't pretend to be any sort of an expert on it. I'm not. But I think I've sort of wrapped my head around, kind of around the basics of it. And I'm not really sure, however, how it ends up. And, well, you'll see what I mean as we go. So, the very first thing to note is that we start off with a straight line. Well, that's not very straight, but you get the idea. And we have a start point for our purposes and an end point for our purposes. We're going to say that the start point is in the 1940s. Pardon my terrible handwriting. And we're going to say, assuming that the timeline is holding up, that the end year is 2023 in the end game. Now, that being said, I'm not sure that we had a decade worth of events happening from 2008 to 2018. Perhaps we did. I feel like some of the films happened concurrently. But nevertheless, we assume that the events from 2008 to 2018 happened. And then 5 years later brings us to 2023. This is, for most of us, the way time works. Somewhere around here, maybe, we have 2012, the time of the first Avengers. And somewhere around here, maybe, we have 2014. Although that's a bad-looking 2014. The time that is sort of important for this film. Now, we know that around here in 2018, the snap happened of Infinity War. And then we had a 5-year gap from 2018 to 2023, where half of all living things were snapped out of existence until we had a mouse or a rat or something walk across a control panel, and it brought Scott Lang back out from the quantum realm. Now, if you will recall, Doctor Strange had looked at 14,605 possible outcomes, and they only won one. So the first thing that had to happen is for the rat, mouse, whatever you want to call it, to walk across the electronics. In any series of those 14 million outcomes where that didn't happen, they did not stop Thanos. So the first thing that had to happen was the rat, mouse doing that. And for Scott, this 5 years passed in about 5 hours, which tells us right away that though time is still linear and moving forward, it's not necessarily moving forward at the same rate or in the same way across realms. Worth noting, and kind of important as we get going. Well, we find out now that we have the opportunity to not so much change things, but to rectify things, which is a big difference. In many stories with time travel, we have always sort of learned that you can take an event back here, say, where I have that orange dot, and change something, and it will affect the future here, or even affect the future here. But what if that's not the case? What if we've understood it incorrectly all along? What if you can rectify things, but that doesn't change what happened? And that's where the time travel sort of comes into play with Endgame. It's sort of a mix of time travel, along with, I guess, multiple dimensions, multiple universes. So now in 2023, we have Scott Lang come back, and they decide to do the time heist. And the time heist, quite honestly, says that right here in 2023 is where we will start. And this will take us back to the past. Now you'll notice I didn't just draw a line back. Indeed, I drew it down a little bit, because the 2012 or earlier that they go back to, such as the 70s where they encounter that Tesseract, since Loki, of course, steals one, they're not necessarily gone back to the same 2012 or the same 1970s that they originally left from. Because they're going back now and they're changing something, they would be, in essence, creating a new future going from that point onward. Had they done nothing, in the situations where the mouse did not walk across the keyboard and Scott Lang did not come back, we have this, what I'll call, prime timeline continuing on with half the population gone. But in those events where the mouse did come back and where they did go back in time, now we have a different sort of timeline moving forward. One where they get the Infinity Stones, one where Thanos finds out earlier than he would have normally that the Infinity Stones were in play, and all he decided to do was sort of speed things up, expedite things, use Pym particles, and kind of come forward to the future himself anyway. And some people have said, how did Thanos manage to bring, his whole army forward? Look, he's really, really smart. Ma is really, really smart. Between both of them, I'm sure they could replicate a bunch of Pym particles to be able to bring their whole army forward. Nevertheless, at this point, the orange section here is really the timeline that we're using in Endgame. And, of course, we have another snap that takes place that brings half the population back. And presumably that is the timeline that will keep going. Now, you'll notice we have two timelines. But that's not it, because we have something else happen in this film. We have, in order to keep the prime timeline of black and even the orange timeline intact, we have Cap, who, at about here, decides to go back. Now he goes all the way back to the 40s again. And he yet again lives another life. And eventually comes out into the timeline that we see in the orange. All of this seems like layers of timelines. Everything that happened in the black line happened. At some point, in certain aspects of those 14 million that Doctor Strange looked at, Scott came back. Then, of the ones where Scott came back, a certain proportion had the heroes figure out that you could do time travel and go back in time. And then, of course, come forward with the Infinity Stones and win. But it only happened once. And in that one time, it also required that Cap would have to go back and return those stones into position so that all of this series of events could play out. And Cap threw a little monkey wrench in things when he decided to go right back to the 40s and live some semblance of a life with Peggy. But where does that kind of leave us? Well, that leaves us here. We have one timeline that I'm going to call the Cap timeline. The Endgame rectified timeline, what I'll call the Prime timeline. The Prime timeline is what the other 21 movies have followed. It's where the snap happened. It's where the universe is existing with only about half of the population. So where do things stand by the end of Endgame? Well, there's kind of two ways to look at it. One, you could say the Prime ended and this one went on because Cap is an old man. Really, his story is done. So his is kind of ended. I won't put a line there because it's not exactly ended. He's still alive. He's just old. Of course, that's not the only way to look at things. We could say that there was a convergence, that time always seeks to correct itself, and that we had a convergence where the Endgame rectified timeline and the Prime timeline eventually cross each other, come in contact, and at the very least work in concert and unison. And that the future of the MCU will be somewhere around here. The bad timeline, where half of the population is vanished and snapped away, is rectified. And this is what we have going forward. That's assuming that the orange and the black timelines are not running parallel to each other, but are, in fact, on a course of convergence. Then that leaves Captain America's timeline, our little green friend. And one of two things could happen here. Either Captain America kept enough particles that he, at some point, made another jump from his alternate universe back to at least the movie universe, if not the Prime universe. Or, potentially, one could say that even Cap's timeline eventually, since time seeks to rectify itself, comes up in unison here. And that orange circle is most likely where the future of the MCU will go. But it doesn't need to go that way. Let me explain again by taking us back to our three separate timelines. We could end up with further movies in the Prime timeline. In the Prime timeline, these would be movies that would happen either as prequels, or they would be movies that happen in a universe where Thanos' snap was never corrected. So here, Thanos still won. But also here, we have Cap, who is still alive and young. We have Tony, who is still alive and relatively young, but Iron Man is still alive. We have Natasha, who is still alive. Then we have the the green Captain timeline. There could at least be one Captain America movie there, where we find out what he did when he went back with the Infinity Stones, and we find out kind of how his life went with Peggy, and if they stayed together or didn't stay together. Did she still end up having, married someone else and having her children? Did things still work out as they were supposed to for her? So, with the green timeline, we could at least have another Cap film. Pardon my terrible handwriting. But then we have that orange timeline. The timeline we're left with at the end of the end game. And the timeline that I think is the one that will take us forward. If not linked up with that one. Perhaps this isn't possible if we have those timelines converge. This here, at the end of Endgame, is our main timeline. Whether it's connected to the original of the first 21 films or not, it's the one we have going forward. None of this negates what already came before it. It's just the way things will be going forward. Star Trek fans already know this. They know that the original, Enterprise, that the original Star Trek, that Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager all happened. But then when we went to the films, Spock went back in time, and there was a huge cataclysmic event that occurred, and now everything was fair game going forward into the future because the game had changed. And even those fans were okay with it and have realized that now there's two universes going on. The TV one, which is the Prime universe, and now a film universe. Well, it's a similar sort of thing here. We do have one totally intact universe. All those events happened, but now we've had things occur that change things just enough and rectify other things just enough. And by change things, I mean we have certain characters now that are gone or have passed away, such as Natasha and Iron Man. But we also have the snap, not so much undone as fixed. But that's sort of where we stand now. Hopefully, that's somewhat clear. But if it's true, and this is the timeline that we have left, then the question could be asked. What comes next?
Gosh, do I hope that cleared up some of the confusion around how time works. In a way, we created multiple timelines. Now, whether they stay intact as separate entities or whether they are always moving toward convergence, I don't think we know that yet. And I don't even know if that's been answered, and I don't even know if I'm understanding their concept of time travel correctly. But it's sort of the best that I have. And like I said, we have three possibilities. The green line, or the cap line, if you will, at least opens the possibility for a standalone Captain America Steve Rogers film where we learn about him going back to the past and living that sort of domesticated life, and whether or not he ever put the shield back on and became Captain America again in all those years. We could also find out if his timeline merely converges with that of the Endgame, or if he makes a deliberate specific jump from his now altered timeline, altered universe, back to the one that we're currently watching in Endgame. And then there's the black line, what I call the Prime Universe, the one that we've been following through 21 films. The one where they start out being in the Endgame with half of the population of all living things gone, but then things get kinda messy. And somewhere in between the green line of the Cap timeline at the end of the movie and the black line of the Prime timeline at the beginning of the movie, we have the orange timeline, which I think is the one that they're going to use going forward. The one where Cap retired and got old. The one where Tony made the ultimate sacrifice, which I think was a perfect rounding out of his story arc, going way back to when Cap said to him that you weren't the guy to lie down on the wire. Tony was the ultimate guy in the end to lie down on the wire. That being said, even if in moving forward in Phase 4 we're going to stick with that orange line, it's not to say that we can't cross back to the Prime timeline at some point and at least drag certain characters from it, like a young Cap who would still be in existence there, just as half the population would still be gone. There's nothing saying we can't go back to that black timeline and grab Iron Man if we really need him. Use some of those Pym particles to go back in that timeline and nab him along the way. There's nothing saying that we can't have these things happen sometime in the future. Do I think it's going to happen anytime soon? No. But with a lot of kind of questions about, hey, did something in the past affect the future? I don't think that those are unanswered questions or plot holes if you understand how they're using time effectively. But that doesn't mean that we're not left with burning questions at the end. Indeed, we're left with many. For example, we know that Cap took back the stones. How did he put the ether back? Did he put it back into Jane? Did Rocket give him a way to inject it back into her body? What about the stone that came from the Tesseract? Was he able to put that back in the Tesseract somehow? And if so, how? What did he do with Thor's hammer? Where exactly did he put it? What about that shield? Now, some people have suggested, theoretically, that perhaps he was given another shield by T'Challa, since Cap's original shield was kind of destroyed in the huge battle. Maybe he was given one by T'Challa, but then where was it? Some have said that Scott shrank it down and that Cap probably had it in his pocket, just in case he would need it. But wasn't actually carrying it on his person, on his arm, when he went back in time. I think that's kind of a far-fetched theory, but it could work. What about the Soul Stone? Did he just go back and say, hey, Red Skull, haven't seen you in a while, man. What have you been up to? That seems kind of unlikely. Some people have asked, if you bring back the Soul Stone, does that mean he was able to get a soul back for it? A Gamora, a Natasha. But apparently, according to the directors, no. That's the price of the Soul Stone. Even if you only want to use it temporarily, you must give a soul in order to obtain it. And some people have criticized and said, hey, we didn't even see the Soul Stone used in the films. Perhaps we didn't. But my understanding is that that stone may be the most powerful. It is the one that evidently can, at the, cellular, at the microscopic, at the soul level, change a person, change the character, change who and what they are, change their very nature. That is an incomparable power, indeed. What about Gamora? Speaking of her, if Tony made the snap at the end that made Thanos and his entire fleet vanish, wasn't Gamora part of that fleet? So, though Quill is looking for her at the end of Endgame, is she really still in existence to find? Some people have asked, how come Nebula could kill herself and that doesn't make her disappear in the future? Well, because one is an alternate timeline nebula. The nebula of 2023 is still the same nebula that went right through the Prime timeline. The nebula that she shot was one that was taken out of 2014 and put into the orange alternate timeline. One didn't really affect the other. They're traveling two different life courses, if you will. Just as the Thanos that made it to 2018 and was on that farm still made it to 2018 and was on that farm. As where the alternate timeline Thanos jumped right from 2014 to 2018. When he said that he was inevitable, he meant that whether he does the snap in 2014 or whether he does the snap in 2018, the snap was always going to happen. Out of 14,605,000 possibilities, 14,604,000 of those did indeed have Thanos being inevitable. But that one was where things changed. And that one, while Stephen Strange was holding back the water, he held up his finger. This was the one. Tony was the only one who could get close enough to Thanos to do the alternate version of the snap. He's the only one who could win. Tony had to lie down on the wire. And I don't know if I ever respected the character of Iron Man more. And I am a child who grew up with the comics long before the MCU was films. And I was always, Iron Man is kind of cool. But, Now, I have a whole new respect, which I think is a testament as well to how well Robert Downey Jr. played the character. So where do we go from here? And are we done with the holes? Not quite. There are still other questions. Some people have said, hey, Spider-Man is back, but nobody graduated. What do you mean nobody graduated? He was gone. His friend was gone. They both got snapped back and it was all right. But surely some of their schoolmates graduated and are 5 years older. Some of them aren't. We saw kids walking around the school. That's not saying that none of them didn't age. It just meant there are kids in school. Peter is still one of those kids in school, as is his friend, whose name I cannot remember. Where did Loki go with the Tesseract? I'm sure that will be explored, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the MCU shortly. Why was Harley at Iron Man's funeral? Why not? He had a connection to Iron Man in his shed, or his garage, whatever it was. And he helped him in a tough spot when he was being overcome with anxiety. I think it was very fitting for that kid to be there, grown up. Do I think that it means he's going to be the next Iron Man? No, I don't. But I suppose anything could happen. I do have a thought about what might come next, however, for that character. But perhaps the biggest one. Do the Avengers still exist? I mean, by the end of the film, Cap is retired. Tony and Natasha, they have passed away. And Hawkeye has retired. Hulk's arm is not in great shape. And Thor has gone off with the Asgardians of the Galaxy, as they have affectionately become known. By the way, I think Thor with the Guardians is brilliant. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I love how he calls Rocket Rabbit. I think it's great. I think it's hilarious, and I really hope he's in Guardians Volume 3. But the point is that the 6 originals are no longer there. Sure, Fury's still there, and perhaps we do have sort of a ragtag band together like Winter Soldier, like Falcon, who presumably will become the new Captain America, like War Machine. I'm so glad he's no longer Iron Patriot. I didn't dig that at all. I thought that was awful. We do have Spider-Man still there, so we do have some iteration of. But I think things are about to get very interesting in Phase 4. Now, I said perhaps we could call the MCU the MCM. Maybe this will now become the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. If the 3 timelines, if not more that were created, but if at least the 3 timelines that I outlined exist, then we have stories that could still be told with the characters we know and love that survived the snap, happening in the Prime timeline. Granted, those stories would probably still be quite sad, since things didn't turn out well for a lot of people there. We certainly have stories that could be told, or a story at least that could be told, in the Cap timeline. And then we have several stories that could be told in what I'm calling the Endgame timeline, the orange line. I think that that's not what we're going to get, but it would be interesting to see it, and it's an idea and a concept that could be revisited in the future, depending on how contracts and whatnot are negotiated with the applicable talent involved, the actors. So what do we know about what's coming up? Well, we know that we're getting 3 programs on Disney+, that being Loki, which I guess is not going to be a redeemed Loki. It's rather going to be a Endgame timeline Loki, the one who disappeared with the Tesseract, I would assume. We know we're getting a Falcon and Winter Soldier series, though I assume that that will be kind of telling the story of how Falcon becomes the new Captain America and earns what he feels to be the mantle of the Shield. And we know that we are getting a Hawkeye series where I believe he is going to be, of course, molding the next generation of Hawkeye, which we've already had alluded at the beginning of Endgame. So we know we're getting those 3 TV series, I guess TV series, streaming series, for sure. Well, then what about the films? Word is that really Phase 3 doesn't end with Endgame, it's going to end with Spider-Man Far From Home, which evidently takes up 2 or 3 minutes after Endgame ends. Interesting. I think that it will be the go-between of Phase 3 to Phase 4. And going forward, perhaps Spider-Man will become far more prominent. We also know we're getting a Black Widow film. I assume that that will be a prequel occurring in the Prime timeline, the black line that I had. Maybe I'm wrong. The Snap could not undo her sacrifice. Therefore, she is not in existence, or at least she's not alive in the Orange Endgame timeline. I don't know if there's a way that Cap could have brought her back to life in the Cap timeline, but I don't think so. I think that's wishful thinking. Word is we're getting the Eternals. We already know Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is coming up. I presume it will be some sort of a search for Gamora type of deal, but we shall see. The Eternals could mean the Celestials going forward. I don't know who the next major villain will be. I'm not sure how you top Thanos. For some reason I keep thinking Galactus, but I really don't know. I do think that things could become very interesting, though. Perhaps the shift from the Avengers, so to speak, will happen. Yes, we will have the remaining characters that we know and love be the link between Phase 3 and Phase 4. But with the recent acquisition of the Fox properties by Disney, it means we could have several more characters go added back to the Marvel Universe. The Fantastic Four, I believe. The X-Men. I would be leery about kind of reintroducing those characters too soon, because if you recast them and don't recast them correctly, they may not be received so well. After all, if you try to have somebody else play Logan, I don't know, how would you feel as a fan? I'd have to see how it's cast. What about somebody else cast as Deadpool? I think Ryan Reynolds really sort of owns that role, and I like him doing it. There's a way to incorporate these characters and a time and a place to do it, and I'm sure it's being thought out, if not already thought out. I certainly look forward to seeing what comes. If the 3 timelines stay separate, then we could very much have an MCM, a Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. If they're going to be unified back together, well, then I guess the term MCU will still hold true. Now, what about Iron Man? Are we done with him? Is he finished? I certainly hope not, but I don't know if we will get Tony Stark back the way we ever had him before. Perhaps we could if he is pulled out from the Prime timeline somehow, where certainly versions of him should still exist. But I think it's more realistic to think, or at least hope, that we could get him as a hologram. We've already had that alluded to. After all, in the comics, he uploaded his essence, I guess we'll call it, his intellect into AI, and really he sort of became the Jarvis, or the Friday, if you will, for the Iron Heart suit, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the one worn by Riri. I think that's her name. I'm doing a lot of I think in here. I get it. But the point is, the mantle gets taken up, and in essence, Tony does sort of live on and have a role, a potential role. And even as the AI, just like Jarvis could control the Iron Man suits, apparently AI Tony Stark can still control the Iron Man suits. And if we're lucky enough as fans to kind of have that happen, then perhaps all of us who are, mourning the end of the Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man era, perhaps we'll find some vindication and joy in that same character going forward as the new phase of the MCU unfolds. At the end of the day, what do I think of Marvel Avengers Endgame? It's a 10 plus, not because it's a flawless film, but because it is the culmination of a decade worth of storytelling. It is done so very brilliantly and creatively. And because it is the sort of film that leaves you feeling satisfied. Satisfied, at least in terms of a justified ending. Maybe not a happy ending. And the questions it leaves you with has all of us talking. And isn't that a good way to go into phase 4? Being curious about what will come next. Anyway, let me know what you think about this film. Once you've seen it, of course. By now, if you've gotten this far, I certainly hope you have. I love to hear from you guys. I thank you for dropping by, for giving me some of your extremely valuable time. I very much look forward to the next time that you and I get together to have another visit right here inside the videos.